good way to argue the case against prostitution is probing your opponent to explain their position on how they came to their conclusions. Many people hold strong views about the sex industry with little actual research or political theory to back it up, which doesn't mean you should treat them arrogantly or make them feel dumb, but you should lead them to conclude for themselves that they probably need to inform themselves about the issue more before coming to final conclusions. Ask what the inherent worth of prostitution is. Our side of the argument can list arguments all day long about why prostitution is incompatible with the human rights of women, but discussions take an interesting turn once you turn it around and ask proponents and defendants of the sex industry to justify why they believe it needs to be kept in place. Directly ask the sex industry proponent, if prostitution were to disappear from society, what is it that would be lost? What is it that prostitution can uniquely provide us with, which cannot be had in any other way? You're likely to hear one of the following arguments in response. 1. It's the right of women who wish to sell sex to do so. But is it really? This statement is something I would strongly challenge. Yes, women have a right to choose their occupation and their sexual partners, but both making enough money to make a living and a wide array of sexual partners is perfectly available outside of prostitution. Both these rights are granted in a fair and equal society, and every single woman and man on this planet is capable of other things despite sexually pleasing strangers, meaning that the loss of prostitution does not infringe on anyone's livelihood nor sexual agency. Sex and work are disconnected in a society without prostitution, but neither is lost. Those who go as far as arguing that prostitution liberates women's sexuality are grasping at straws once you ask them to explain what exactly women are liberated from when sex becomes a commodity. 2. Point out to your opponent that viewing prostitution as a form of sexual preference or even as a sexuality in itself logically means that some women and a few men get a special sexual kick out of getting paid. Getting paid for sexual acts is the only thing that prostitution uniquely offers the prostituted, but there is no one whose pleasure is enhanced from dollar bills on the nightstand. No one orgasms harder because of the amount of cash in their bank account. Arguing that prostitution offers new sexual pathways and that getting paid enhances women's pleasure is ridiculous. Prostitution isn't a sexuality. It is the commodification of sexuality. As stated prior, if receiving money for sexual access gives a person a temporary high, that is not evidence of an inherent kink for money, but evidence of learned behavior. Learned behavior which can ultimately be traced back to an abusive past or a misogynistic abusive society with fucked up values. Here are some quotes from sex trade survivors describing this. Every time a man came into the brothel, paying me to satisfy him, I felt that I was worth something. Not because of him, not because of what was going on, but because of the money. The money seduced me for a long time, feeling that I was actually worth something. How cruel is that? I left the room with money in my hand. I thought that it was easy money. I felt free, unencumbered. I had a sense of pseudo-sexual empowerment. At least I didn't have to pretend I was in love. I wasn't trapped in an ongoing abusive relationship, or so I thought. There is no logical or human rights argument for connecting sex and work, as there isn't for organ trade or surrogacy. Additionally, we know that the participation in all of these trades is primarily involuntary, and protecting the rights of those otherwise exploited must be prioritized over the wish of a tiny handful to connect sex and work any given day. Lest people misconstrue your argument here, this is neither a judgment of people voluntarily in the sex industry, nor is the abolitionist goal to force people to leave prostitution. Our position remains to offer effective support and exit services which remain optional and open to all, regardless of reasons for entry or political conviction. 3. Legal prostitution combats rape. I've made a whole video on this incredibly fallacious argument and put a link in the description. In short, this is simply untrue. Rape and sexual violence are incredibly prevalent in societies with widespread prostitution, and even if prostituted women provided a human shield for everyone else, it would be morally unjustifiable to designate a certain class of women and men to prop up as rape fodder for the rest of the population. Additionally, your opponent just conceded the point that sex buyers are sexually entitled at best and predators and rapists at worst. If these men can't be unleashed on the general female population, how is it justified to unleash them on the prostituted? 4. Those who claim that legal prostitution will prevent the spread of STDs have their heads even deeper in the sand, as it is the male buyers, not the prostitute women, who control the use of condoms. And the best way to combat and spread STDs into and out of the prostitution industry is, of course, reducing its size and ultimately abolishing it. Ask how your opponent pictures safe, happy prostitution. Challenge people who argue in favor of legal prostitution and envision this version of prostitution to be safe, to explain in detail how they plan to eradicate violence against prostitute people. If they claim that this is already being done effectively in places like Germany, Australia, or New Zealand, ask them why the legal brothels there still have pimps acting as bodyguards, panic buttons mandated in every room, information websites and pamphlets telling women how to report rape, and what types of painkillers and lube to use to dull the pain of penetration. Ask them how this is not strong evidence that the threat and reality of violence hangs over the head of prostitute women under legalization too. I have had extensive debates about this, where I kept asking my opponent to describe how they would make sure that every sexual encounter with a punter was truly safe, consensual, and fulfilling for the prostituted person. They'll end up making the argument against legalization for you most of the time.